To start the discussion about the SDG agenda, I think at this stage you have to look at a broad statement that is pessimistic, which is that there was a very substantial ambition and optimism in the three major international events of 2015. The Financing for Development Summit in Addis in July, the SDG Summit in New York on the 25th of September, and COP21 in Paris. Everybody knew that there was heightened ambition, do things differently, new, smarter partnerships, greater international engagement, and ambition that we must banish extreme poverty and exclusion over the next 15 years. However much you say there will be no smart partnerships and nations will reorient their planning processes, greater coherence around the agenda, there was always the inevitable issue that there was required greater resource additionality, either domestically mobilized or reduced hemorrhage of domestic resources, or resource additionality either from the private sector or ODA for the poorest among us. There was an assumption that trade, like technology, will be playing important roles as enablers. As we enter the year when we must now start taking stock, are we taking off? Is the startup rocket launched properly? Are we being able to build the momentum to achieve the agenda? We have two things. One is the level of ambition. Another is the trends in activity. One of the markers that we use about the level of ambition, banishing extreme poverty, is an assumption which is very, very ambitious. You see, if you look at what happened in China between 1994 and 2014, the Chinese economy grew on average between 8 and 10% GDP per capita per annum. During that period, they reduced extreme poverty to less than 12%, between 11 and 12%. Today, the countries we call LDC have about the same number of poor people as China had in 1994. And we are pledging that in 15 years, they will not have reduced to 12%, but they will have eradicated extreme poverty. The implication of this is that LDCs can perform at least as well as China did over the past 20 years. And at the annual meeting of the Bank and the Fund in Washington early last year, I remember one of the speakers saying, can anybody raise their hand if they don't believe this is possible? Nobody raised their hand. Do you believe we'll do it? Everybody said we'll do it. Now we want to see, have we laid the foundation for doing it? A number of factors cause some pessimism. Number one, from the trade end of things. It has always been challenging to assume that you can discipline the rule-making process in trade to be a contributor to development. So it's not just about liberalizing trade, but that certain affirmative action, certain asymmetrical commitments will make trade rule-making contribute to development. This is, to my mind, the summary of Doha Round. This assumption that over the next period, rule-making will actually have direct developmental outcomes. The jury is still out as to whether that assumption, which we have been carrying with us since 1996 from Uruguay, actually is realistic. Some of us are getting increasingly pessimistic about that for a number of reasons. First, the track record hasn't been very, very good. What the development round has done is stall rulemaking instead of trigger development outcomes from trade. I can see there's a lot of soul searching about what happened in Arabia, the WTO's ministerial, 10th ministerial. But to my mind, I see much more a PR exercise than an analytical exercise. Everybody is making an effort to say that Nairobi was successful. But success can be that you avoided disastrous failure and you build up the PR to make it look successful. Success some other time usually is that you achieved the goals you set out to achieve. And my sense of assessing all the statements about Nairobi being successful is much more about avoiding disaster than achieving goals set out. But Nairobi also has two critical things about the trade community and attaining Agenda 2030. One, a process started in Bali 2 years before Nairobi, where you could take trade facilitation out of the basket, agree on it, file that as an achievement, and say, let us see we can achieve more. It breached one of the principles of Doha, single undertaking. So single undertaking died in Bali. When we came to Nairobi, we had abandoned the pretensions that nothing will be resolved until everything is resolved. That phenomenon in Bali basically meant that those who have been stalling rule-making because of blackmail, that unless you get what I want, you will not give you what you want. They lost ground in Nairobi. I don't think it is necessarily a bad thing, because I think it was very ambitious to assume that you could tidy up everything with so many members through consensus and move on. It's a reality check. But there's a second thing also that happened in Nairobi, but now this one was the first time it happened in the multilateral system. That they filed a finding that we have disagreed. At Nairobi, I think it was paragraph 30, which said some members want to continue negotiations on the Doha round. Some other members do not want to continue negotiation on the Doha round. That's the first time in the WTO's history that a ministerial had a resolution that we disagreed. And that means it's the end of the era of consensus as the basis of moving forward. But I think what we have seen also marked out of Nairobi, but had been developing over some time, is the weaknesses of consensus-based progress was irritating to those members who wanted to have decisions that were urgent to them in the sense of emerging technology and emerging challenges. For example, over the past 10 years, the growing significance of intellectual property rights, the growing interest in moving on to digital economy, addressing questions of cyber governance, addressing questions of all the issues related to e-commerce that were never anticipated, were never embraced at Doha. Have been frustrated by those who are saying, unless you finish what we have as our menu, we cannot move to new territory. I have been guilty of that myself. 10 years ago, as the Minister of Trade of my country, I was one of those starting in Cancun who said, keep the promise of Doha. Unless we finish what we have here, you cannot start opening up Singapore issues, public procurement, competition, and so on. Now, what has happened is the emergence of mega plurilateral negotiations, RCEP and TTIP and TPP, with the understanding informal, but actually very real, that whatever agreement is arrived at by this limited negotiation, as the principles entrained in the TISA negotiation, the trade and services negotiations, become binding even to those who are not at the negotiating table. And that phenomenon has meant that the frustration of being held back by a single undertaking will be breached by being able to make progress through plurilateral negotiations. What it has meant is that rulemaking is increasingly being freed from being hostage to a round which was insisting development must be the front burner of this negotiation. But what it also means is that the architecture of deliberately carving development outcomes out of trade rulemaking has reached a dead end. That does not mean that the role of trade for development and the SDG agenda has come to an end. What it means is that we have to reassess assumptions that the work being carried out at WTO will deliver on goal number 17 of Agenda 2030. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention. That is one of the slowing factors about the momentum and ambitions of last year. The second thing is something that was emerging slowly but has come central since the second half of last year, which is the unanticipated massive dislocation of broad populations from the Middle East into Europe. The involuntary migrations surrounding Syria, Libya, and the crisis in a lot of the Arab world over the past year. It was a disruptive phenomenon enough, but two spin-offs have been directly related to the SDG agenda. First of all, the relative collapse of the state means the instruments of prosecuting, of continuing the commitments of Agenda 2030 in many of those disrupted societies are very weakened. There's nobody to keep the promise of SDG in Syria, in in Iraq, and in Libya. So already that reversals on the ground. But secondly, and perhaps of more universal value, is the fact that across the board, virtually every OECD country in Europe, which has been making commitments about keeping certain targeted levels of resources to support the most vulnerable countries in the pursuit of SDG agenda, either through smarter partnerships on ODA or through state-facilitated enhanced private sector flows, has rewritten its budget by slipping mitigation of immigration into the envelope for development cooperation. That the immediate casualty in budgetary terms of the immigration crisis in Western Europe has been the cutback on ODA, and international cooperation resources are being put into cooperation on immigrants. And similarly, that therefore countries on the front line that can mitigate the flood of immigrants have a position to pull greater resources than could possibly have been expected to be allocated. You can see the example of Turkey, the level that the European Union is ready to relocate resources to support Turkey's wishes as a condition for its playing a greater role as a bulwark against enhanced flooding of immigrants into Europe. The net consequence is there's a smaller resource basket for supporting the most vulnerable, even with increased ambition from at least official resources, particularly in areas where we expected a partnership on infrastructure. That leaves the challenge basically now to say, okay, the private sector was always expected to come along with fresh resources and new impetus on opportunities. That development assistance is helping governments to prepare investment in infrastructure projects as bankable projects. That remains a very important hope, and if we do not succeed in gaining the confidence of the private corporations, which today are awash with the liquid resources, to put some of those into investments that lead to productive capacity improvements and structural transformation in the weakest economies, the Agenda 2030 will be a failure before it has begun. What has been the trend? Last month, we at UNCTAD published our first view of global investment flows for the year 2015. On the positive, there was a very dramatic increase in resources, in investments. For the first time in a number of years, the US became the leader. There are some countries which seem to have very dramatic expansion of FDI flows, like Netherlands. The Netherlands with $90 billion of inflows looked like a dramatic, unexpected success case. Hong Kong was number 2 after US, mainland China was number 3, and Netherlands was number 4. But then you look at what is the essence of these investment flows for that year. 65% of all the global flows in 2015 were mergers and acquisitions. No greenfield investments. But not even, it was not even proper mergers and acquisitions. There is a a funny trick, smart accounting exercise that multinationals have been doing, what we call inversion. And inversion, a successful corporation in the US sees that it's going to have a very large tax to declare, and income to declare. But it knows that US is a high tax territory. So what it does, it identifies a small company in Ireland, Netherlands, or Switzerland, buys that company, and they merge. Then it declares that the corporate headquarters of the merged enterprise is in the territory where the small company that was bought is. So then the company declares its profits in the Netherlands, in Ireland, or in Switzerland. They will pay much less tax than if they're declared at the headquarters in the US. So some of the so-called mergers were actually inversions which were shifting tax responsibilities to lower tax territories. And this is what has added to a growing demand for tax fairness. Something we have been asking for on behalf of developing countries, but now it's being asked for by the most developed countries, for naturally not very altruistic reasons. Anyways, but these clouds the picture you get about the nature of investment flows. For the developing world, there was a number of very clear indicators that we have. The first one was a dramatic decline in FDI to commodity-dependent countries. The largest drop in FDI flows in the whole world last year was the Russian Federation. 92% decline on FDI inflows from the previous year. 92%. Kazakhstan, 74%. No, 62%, sorry. The second largest was South Africa with 74% decline from 4.7 billion to 1.8 billion year to year. Across the board, developing Africa had Africa had a decline of 31% of FDI flows from 2014 to 2015. The largest hits are areas of Central and Southern Africa, reflecting two things. The first one, of course, the vulnerabilities inherent in countries that were dependent on the boom because of the commodity super cycle. When it went bust, all optimism in the system went out. But even importantly, I mention this because at a time when we expect resource flows into productive sectors, into infrastructure, into digital inclusion, as part of the foundation for the goals of Agenda 2030, we are seeing reversals, both in absolute terms of the resources flowing to the developing world, but critically away from greenfield infrastructure, developmental products, into mergers and acquisitions and inversions as tax responsibility shifts. So this is, I didn't want to come to start a gloomy picture about where we're going. We are trying to go into the sunshine, but we have to take stock of the challenges before us. How shall we surmount them? I think many of them are surmountable. I think 2015 is not a critically indicative year of longer-term trends, partly because the soft recovery from the crisis started in 2008 will not be that forever. And similarly, the unique situation of GDP growing faster than trade globally cannot be a long-term phenomenon. Okay, there is a slowing down of China as the main engine, but we are seeing alternative engines slightly rising on the horizon. The dynamism of India is one clear example of this. Secondly, greater interest in commitment to new governance, bold decisions on financial governance globally is potently well for dealing with some of the anxieties that have fueled our observational trends. For example, the recent meeting of G20 ministers in China, in Shanghai, did make statements of commitment to much more bold action in helping globally deal with the soft recovery. Similarly, we have reason to expect that a greater engagement on the role of technology as an enabler for resuscitating not just global growth, but creating new dynamism in the global economy is going to be very important. Trade will continue playing an important role, but I don't think trade is going to be fettered by trade rule-making as a phenomenon. What might fetter it, I think, is the strange turn in domestic politics in the U.S. Because after a half decade of American engagement on global trade liberalization and rulemaking in the TTP and TPP, TTIP and TPP, we are seeing that the leading candidates for the next election on both sides are promising to reverse what America has been trying to get done. So you say like it's a zero-sum game for those who believed that the gains of greater market opening through the transatlantic and trans-Pacific partnerships will add an impetus to global trade. Because all the three main candidates of the Republican and the main candidate of the Democratic Party have all promised to turn their backs on the agreements. Well, but America is not a single culprit. I think that even in a lot of Europe, there has been a substantial growing of cold feet over the transatlantic partnership. So the cycles of optimism and pessimism in how to start boosting trade and to bring it back as an important engine of new growth and value creation is facing very, very substantial complications. What I would like to suggest as a small set of things that could contribute to how do we regain the dynamism, how do we regain the momentum. First of all, a successful harvest on the current initiative to silence the guns around Syria will be very, very important, beyond the confines of Syria and its sadly disrupted population. Similarly, the increasing work, particularly in the UN family, to look at humanitarian, peace, and development work as sides of the same, facets of the same entity, delivering as one between the agencies on these different frontiers is an important step in the right direction in optimizing resources, but also in having more prioritized focus in what we do. But more importantly, beyond the UN, the world will need a number of things. Build on the very positive chairmanship of China of G20, which is emphasizing a lot the development angle. I think the presidency of China has put more emphasis on development considerations as part of the responsibility of G20 than any other presidency in recent years. Now, if that can be built in such a way as to find new engagement, commitments from the G20, engagement and listening to the challenges from the B20, the Business 20, and now much more dialogue on how do we commit limited resources in smart partnerships, we must reverse some of the pessimism that is coming from a slow start out of the blocks. Similarly, a number of things some of us have been arguing for some time. UNCTAD has been arguing for a while about dealing with investment-related tax evasion and resource outages. Last year, we did quantify that up to $100 billion was lost through investment-related tax avoidance or resource transfers. If you put this in a context of Africa, where global FDI to Africa in 2015 was $52 billion. Last year it declined to $38 billion. If there is justice in the movement of investment-related taxes, it will more than compensate for the amount of additional resources going into that continent. And it will enhance state governments' abilities to source their own contribution to the infrastructure revolution that's critically important for inclusive prosperity, for the greening of production processes, and most importantly, for improving the productivity of their labor processes and building productive capacity that will deliver them beyond where they are today. Thank you for your kind attention. I'm sorry I took a bit long.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kituyi, for this interesting introducing remarks.